Hello watch enthusiasts. Now over the past few years, the original Omega Seamaster 300, that's to say the model which ran from 1957 through to 1969, has become a really loved watch amongst collectors, due to its beauty of design, as well as its functionality and the technology which went into this watch, which was very different to what other brands were using, and combined technologies from other brands such as the supercompressor concept with the external bezel to create what was a really quite impressive dive watch for the era. And so as a result, today I'd like to talk about its full history and the various models and variations released over its tenure. But first I'd like to talk about the origins of the Omega dive watch. However, before I begin the video, I would like to encourage you all to join the Watch Guys, which is my group on Snups, the social media platform for sharing pictures of your collections and interests, and where you can discuss matters of horology with myself and indeed other enthusiasts, and where I'll do my utmost to reply to any questions or video requests you happen to give me. Therefore, I would very much encourage you to follow the link down below, or download the app, which is available for Android or iOS, depending on what you're using, and what's most convenient for you, and join the great many others in the group who are now enjoying these additional features and functions that the channel offers. Now, the true beginning of the Omega dive watch is in 1932, with the release of the Omega Marine. And the Omega Marine was in many ways the first of the dive watches ever made in the world, because the only other water-resistant case at the time was the Rolex Oyster case. And this was designed to withstand water ingress in terms of humidity entering the case, whereas this was a watch designed specifically to resist the pressure built up by water above it, and the water column building above the watch. And this featured a number of innovations which seem very alien today, but were fitting in the time. So it was fitted with this double case style, whereby you had a smaller internal case which housed the squared dial, as well as the movement and the crown, and this was attached to one half of the strap, whilst there was a separate section which formed a sort of a helmet over the top of the watch, and could be slammed shut, which would attach the watch together, and thus allow it to be used underwater. The watch also featured one of the first sapphire crystals on a watch in this square section on the outer case, and this allowed the watch to have a much more scratch-resistant display, which wasn't really replicated until much later by other brands. And certainly Omega themselves continued to use Hesalite in a lot of their watches through until the 70s, and even into the 80s. So it is interesting that they use sapphire in this case, but I suppose it's fitting considering the fact that it was designed to be a resilient watch. The strap itself was also rather curious, because the strap was made out of seal leather due to its large fat content, and the fact that this particular type of leather and the skin of a seal was designed to resist water, and the damage that water can do to your skin, whereby, for example, on non-aquatic skin of an animal, there's a lot of water transfer through the leather, whereas on a marine mammal's skin, there's far less of this, and so this made the seal strap rather fitting, I feel, for this watch, especially with its deployant, which was again a great innovation for the era. In terms of tests, the watch first proved its cadet credentials in Lake Geneva, when it was lowered, and sunken in fact, to 73 metres below sea level, which of course does mean that it had to resist about 7 atmospheres, a bit over 7 atmospheres, which for a watch of that era is extremely impressive and does show the fact that it really was a serious dive watch, despite the fact that it doesn't have any of the features we would normally expect to see on a watch of this type. And it was then tested by the Swiss Laboratory for Horology to 135 metres, again demonstrating the care that Omega took with sealing the cases. Now, during the war years, Omega's innovation in terms of water-resistant watches stagnated rather, due to the demand for pilots' watches, which they did produce during the war, as has been seen in various movies, as well as in various pieces of documentation. But in 1948, Omega were called upon to be the official timer for the Olympics. And so as a result, as this coincided with their 100th anniversary, they decided to release a full new range. And this happened to be the Seamaster. And this now, in fact, has become the oldest and most extensively modified range in the history of Omega, since this is the longest running. And these watches were originally steel or gold. There were gold-plated versions as well, with the wider lugs, the quite thick case, but the traditionally dress aesthetic, I suppose, in terms of their dials, with a very simple layout, but still with legible indices and large Dauphine hands which could be easily read at a glance. And the watches also were the first line of watches from Omega to feature O-ring seals, though they weren't made of silicon or rubber in that era, but rather various other perishable materials, because several were used. And these were able to resist 60 metres of water, which for the era was quite impressive for a dress watch, and certainly did set Omega apart as having a watch which actually competed with the Rolex Oyster. Now, in 1953, the release of the Blancpain 50 Fathoms really precipitated the releases of dive watches, and this was very soon followed by the Rolex Submariner in very early 1954. And as a result, Omega realised they had to do something about this. And so in 1957 they released their interpretation of the dive watch, which had some curious features but also some quite legendary touches. And what Omega released in response was the CK2913, or as we all know, the first generation Omega Seamaster 300. And this was a watch which had to approach the aspect of dive watches in a different way to, for example, the Rolex Submariner, because Rolex held the patent on various aspects of its water-resistant technology, for example, the screw-down crown. And 7 versions of the Seamaster 300 in the CK2913 form were released over its 3-year run from 1957 to 1960. And the general features, though, shared by them all, before I go into the details of each, was the fact that these watches all featured the 39mm case. And this was relatively large compared to the 37mm case of the original Submariner. Additionally, it was water-resistant to 200 metres, which, despite the 300-metre connotations of the dial, was equal with the Rolex Submariner of the era. And there are various reasons for this 300 being on the dial. Most suggest that it simply was that people liked the name Seamaster 300 more than Seamaster 200. But there are also rumours that Omega couldn't actually test watches beyond 200 metres, but assumed that it was more water-resistant than that, and so as a result they rated it as such. These watches also featured an acrylic crystal and bezel, which was very much a slim piece and much slimmer than a contemporary bezel today. And they also featured these broadarrow hands, which are really quite wonderful to look at, and featured luminescent material inside them to make them more legible at night. Additionally, the movement inside these watches was different depending on the year, because the original ones had the caliber 500 automatic movement, whereas the later ones had a 501 movement as well. And various variations of this movement, despite being different, did all feature very similar specifications, with a 46-hour power reserve, beating at 19,800 beats per hour, which is about 5.5 beats per second, and had 19 joules. Similarly, these watches also did feature a crown which wasn't the conventional screw-down seen on a modern watch, or indeed on the Rolex Submariner. And the reason for this was that Rolex held the patent for this, and so Omega had to develop their own crown. And this wasn't a screw-down crown, but rather a nailed crown. And this is a crown which is pressed in by the external water pressure, and so acts like a supercompressor. And in this case, the crown did often leak, though, at shallow depths, due to this very system. But nonetheless, Omega didn't really have any other solution as a result of the fact that they couldn't make it a screw-down crown due to the Copyright Acts. Now, the first 2 variants during the run of this watch, during that 3-year run, featured the standard broadarrow hands, which also featured this radium insert in them, as well as the radium dial as well, which all provided a great deal of legibility for the user. However, these models have the quirk that they had a countdown bezel. So that's to say that the bezel would run backwards, running from 50 through to 10 across the clockwise direction. And this didn't prove very useful for divers, but shows that Omega was trying to use new principles for the diving, for the diver who was going to have to use this in the water. Additionally, these watches don't feature any lume on the second hand, which is something that was then offered later on in the range, and featured a simple polished steel second hand, which didn't really offer much legibility unless you were in clear and bright light. Interestingly, this is the model which Omega decided to reproduce earlier this year, celebrating the 60th anniversary of these watches, as the version that was reproduced features the countdown style of bezel. The third 6th iterations of this watch featured a far more conventional layout. Now, the hands and the dial remained identical, although it's worth noting that a lot of these watches were retrofitted with newer hands, rather. And Omega became notorious for doing this, so it is worth noting that a lot of watches that you see from allegedly 1957 do not feature the original hands, and that's why a lot of, for example, 57 watches feature the later hands seen on the twisted lug models, which simply aren't correct for these watches. But the correct hands would have been these broadarrow loomed hands with the lumeless second hand. Additionally, this featured a far more conventional bezel, which was now a count-up bezel, but in every other way was identical to the previous model. And with that count-up style, it became far more practical for the professional diver to be able to time their dives, and to be able to know exactly how much air they still had to breathe. Now, the one aspect that we often associate with this original model, the CK2913, is that large lollipop second hand. And in truth, that was only properly and formally introduced in the final version, the CK2913-7. And we do see some of these lollipop hands on some of the very last of the Dash 6 references, for the simple reason that a lot of these cases and dials and case references had already been produced when they introduced the lollipop secondhand, and so as a result these were put onto those watches. But as a rule we can say that the Dash 7s were the model to have this very unique and very different style of secondhand. And this was a white-painted, elongated secondhand with a large lollipop on the end, which I find to be extremely attractive and very, very appealing, because it gives a very, very different look, and a look which is not usually a piece which would characterise a dive watch, but appears more like, for example, a railway clock. And this was matched with a pair of new hands as well. And these hands featured a smaller Dauphine style of hour hand with a loomed patch down the middle, as well as a partially unloomed Dauphine hand going up for the minute hand, yet this also had a loomed tip, and these are often referred to as small arrow hands rather than the broad arrow hands seen on the previous models. Now, other than these interesting hands, the watch remained identical to previous versions with the same bezel, case, water resistance and movement. But of course has been remembered so immensely because of that second hand, which now as a result of its inclusion in the Bond franchise has become altogether more popular. In 1960 we can see the second generation of these watches, and this was the Seamaster 300 CK14755. And various versions of this were made, but all followed very similar aesthetics, and they kept the 39mm case of previous versions of the CK2913. But instead of having the original handset, they now feature the handset on the revised versions of the Dash 7 versions of the CK2913. And these also featured a new second hand, and gone was the lollipop style second hand, and in was either a straight white hand, or the rather more popular model was the straight white hand with a spear end with loom on it. And this, I feel, defined the aesthetic of the military style of Seamaster 300. Though, of course, these weren't used by the military, that second hand was carried on through to the later models, which were, in fact, used by the Royal Navy. Now, the choice of calibers inside this watch was a very interesting detail about these watches, because there were two movements available. The first was the European version, which was the caliber 552, which is one of the most fantastic movements made by Omega, as this line of movements through the 550s and 560s offered incredible reliability and accuracy and were used in many of the Constellation models. And through their use in these various sports and dress models have been some of the most accurately regulated watches and watch movements ever made, which is quite remarkable for a movement with a base which was nothing too ornate, but Omega really did put incredible quality into these movements, which was a testament really to the brand in that day. But the second movement available was the 550, and the reason for this difference was the difference in laws between Europe and the US. Now, the 552 was a no-date movement, an automatic no-date movement running at 19,800 beats per hour, and was the obvious successor to the 501 seen in the previous version. But this version featured 19 joules in the 552 configuration, which was 2 more than the regulations in the US suggested didn't have to be taxed. Now, any movement above 17 joules in the US market had to be taxed at a different rate to others, and so as a result, Omega, trying to avoid this tax and increasing the prices of these watches in that market, used the 550, which was a 17 joule movement of this type. And the difference here really is that the 550s are today now prone to a great deal of wear, because in several places Omega have had to choose to put in brass pieces in the place of the original jewels that would have protected the various bearings. And so as a result, they're very, very prone to wear, but a very curious detail in terms of the history of these movements. In 1962, we see the 1960 CK14755 replaced by the reference 165.014. And this features the same case, movement, as well as performance as its predecessor. However, it now features a new style of dial. And though early versions of this model were in fact seen with almost identical specifications to the 1960 model, the CK14755, the later versions feature a revised dial, which now removes the triangular indices and replaces them by squared-off rectangular styles, which again match these candle-styled hands, which contain a great deal more luminescent material and are far, far more legible. And so this watch is in fact the model which defined the design for the dial of these watches, and in a strange sort of way the dial of the new modern Seamaster Planet Ocean, which features a very, very similar layout of its dial, though the hands, I must say, have changed since that time. In 1964, we see the second generation of Seamaster 300, and this is the 165.024. And this is a 42mm version of this watch, moving up from the 39mm of the original case. Additionally, we see twisted lugs now with the brushed and polished sections, which are far more ornate and complex than previous cases. Additionally, this case protects the crown by butting up to it and being asymmetrical, which is very similar to the way the Speedmaster Professional contrasted the original Speedmaster, and so made this a far, far more wearable watch in terms of being a professional timepiece. The bezel also saw a very profound change to a far, far more legible style, which featured a much, much thicker style of acrylic bezel insert with luminescent material at every 5-minute marker, which made it a very clearly legible piece underwater, especially in the dark. Additionally, this was far, far more comparable to something like a Rolex Submariner bezel or a Blancpain 50 Fathoms, as it included a far, far thicker area surrounding the numerals, and various versions of these numerals were seen throughout this era, with at least 5 different styles with different fonts, though frankly it's too difficult to catalogue them because there are a lot of conflicting pieces of information. But certainly we do know that various variations with different shapes for the numerals were seen. In terms of movements, we see the same movements offered, with the 550 and the 552 movements being seen in these watches. And the 552 were offered on all models not going to the United States, and these featured a higher joule count, which protected the various bearings from wearing down over time. Whereas the American versions, due to the taxes imposed on movements with more than 17 joules, featured brass bushes in the place of these joules. And so this is why it's not particularly uncommon to see later replaced plates on these movements which increase the joule counts to more than 17 joules, because these were very, very prone to wear and as a result inaccuracy. The dial and handset also remained the same as the refined dial and handset seen on the 1962 165.014, with those enlarged candlestick style of hands, as well as the increased size rectangular indices going around the dial. It is worth noting, however, that various models in the very early Italian ranges did in fact feature the small arrow hands seen on earlier models, due to a lack of supplies of the later hands. But these were very, very quickly replaced, and so as a result these models have become very, very rare. In 1966, Omega created really the definitive Seamaster 300, and this remained the 165.024, and retained the same movement, dial, bezel, and 200-metre water resistance 42mm case. However, the handset was critically changed by changing the hour hand, which was originally a candlestick hand to match the minute hand, to a dagger style of hand or lozenge. And this made the watch immediately more legible for divers, and an extremely clear companion for the regular diver. Additionally, these hands would hold far, far more luminescent material than the equivalents from other brands, making it a very clear choice for ownership for someone who had to use this as a proper instrument. And what this paved the way for was a movement for this watch towards the Royal Navy. And the Royal Navy had for a long time needed a professional dive watch and had used several brands. But this watch really did become the watch of choice. And so in 1967, the Royal Navy decided to take up this watch as their professional dive watch. However, the Royal Navy did dictate several changes to the watch, which had to be made to make this a professional dive watch for their specifications. And the first of these changes was to remove the 12 on the top of the dial and replace it with a large luminescent triangle. And this meant that one could extremely quickly pick out the 12 o'clock position, rather than having the symmetrical style of dial which was originally fitted to these watches. And so as a result, this really did create a watch which, in the dark, was far, far easier to read, and far more clear on the wrist. Additionally, they did dictate that it had to have welded lugs, and this meant that it didn't have spring bars, but rather the bars between the lugs were welded in place. And what this meant was the fact that there was very, very little danger of losing the watch, and it had to be worn on a one-piece style of strap, or a NATO strap, which again made it far, far more resistant to shocks and bumps, simply from a mechanical perspective of remaining on the wrist. These watches also had to feature a small T encircled on the dial above the Seamaster 300, and what this denoted was the fact that tritium was used on the dial, which was mildly radioactive, and so as a result, bearing in mind that it was going to be used around other technology, they had to declare on the dial that it was marginally radioactive, though not radioactive enough to harm a person by any stretch, or even get through the top layer of the skin, being a beta particle emitter, and a weak one at that. But nonetheless, because it was being used around high-precision technology, it did have to denote this on the dial. The final change to this line came in 1967, with the 166.024, which was incidentally the same year as the Royal Navy's collaboration with Omega began with these watches. And these featured one of two movements, either the caliber 563, which was for the US market, which had 17 joules, a quick-set date, and the same features with the hour, the seconds, and the minutes. Whereas the European and rest of the world model with the 565 movement had all of those features plus 24 joules rather than the 17. And this meant that rather than having the brass bushes, you had joules which would reduce wear considerably, but due to that tax I've mentioned earlier in the video, this wasn't the case in the American models. And these featured the same dials as seen previously, but with a shrunken index at 3 o'clock, and instead a black faceted date window with a painted rim was installed. And these most often had black date wheels, though I have seen some white date wheels on versions which have had movement parts replaced. And so we come on to the final watch in the line. And this is still the reference 166.024, however this is the version with the large triangle. And soon after these large triangles began to be used by the Royal Navy on their models, these became available to the general public as an option instead of the 12, 3, 6 and 9 dials. And so they became very popular, in fact, and became seen more and more, and the way you can differentiate between these and the naval models is primarily the fact that you can see these that were on a bracelet, and of course you couldn't fit a bracelet to a watch with fixed lug bars. But similarly you wouldn't see the tritium symbol on the dial, and so this denotes this to be a civilian model. And this did add a certain legibility, though I do still feel the original with the 12, 3, 6 and 9 and the no date is my personal favourite due to its simplicity and charm. It is also worth noting that these dials with the large triangle were available in both the date and non-date versions, so that's to say the 166.024 and the 165.024, thus making them a very appealing option for people who wanted a slightly more legible and professional version of the already fantastic Seamaster 300. And so in 1969 the Seamaster 300 was discontinued and replaced by the Seamaster 200, a model which featured, I think, a more apt name, but I think lost a bit of the characterful and iconic design of this watch, because they just produced so many different models with different cases, which all featured very 70s styles with bright colours and curved edges. Also, they did add the 120 to the line as well in later years, which again offered a slightly more leisurely and more laid-back version with a thinner case and lower water resistance, as well as various chronograph versions. And this was all in addition to the most professional model, the Ploprof, the Seamaster 600 and 1000, which I've talked about in depth in another video. And so at this point I'll end this video with 3 new reiterations of this watch, with on the left-hand side the standard production coaxial version of the original Seamaster 300, now in 41mm, as well as the 41mm Spectre limited edition with the Lollipop second hand, as well as the 12-hour bezel. And then on the right-hand side, the most true to original, being the re-edition trilogy version of the Seamaster 300 released this year at Baselworld, with the original 39mm size case, and the new movement seen in the modern coaxial versions. Anyway, thank you very much for watching, and please do like, share and subscribe to help the channel, and to be able to enjoy more content here in the future. Also, do please leave your comments on Snups, and indeed here, to give me a few ideas about what you thought of this video, and indeed where you think I should go in future with this Story of an Icon segment. So thank you very much for watching, this is I'm on the Watch Guy, over and out.